The gunshot that changed Grace Harper's life rang out under a sky as vast as her dreams and as unforgiving as her past. The year was 1876, and the frontier town of Silverwater, Colorado, was no place for a widow with a 6-year-old daughter. But here she stood, clutching little Abigail's hand while the stagecoach that had delivered them disappeared in a cloud of dust. Grace surveyed the main street with weary eyes. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 8 months now, consumption taking him faster than anyone expected. With no family back east and mounting debts, she'd answered an advertisement seeking a schoolteacher in this remote mining town. It was her last hope. "Mama, I'm hungry," Abigail whispered, tugging at the faded calico of Grace's skirt. Grace smoothed her daughter's unruly auburn curls, so like her own. "Soon, little one. We need to find the mayor's office first." The pair made their way down the muddy thoroughfare, drawing curious glances from locals. Grace kept her chin up despite her threadbare traveling clothes and the holes in Abigail's shoes. Pride was all she had left. The mayor's office was a modest wooden structure wedged between the general store and the saloon. Inside, Mayor Cunningham, a portly man with a magnificent mustache, greeted them with unexpected coldness. "Mrs. Harper," he said, barely looking up from his papers. "We received your correspondence, but there's been a development." Grace's stomach tightened. "Development?" "The town council has reconsidered. We need someone who can commit fully to teaching, someone without." His eyes flicked to Abigail. "Distractions." "My daughter is not a distraction," Grace said, her voice steady despite the panic rising within her. "I assured you in my letters that I'm fully qualified. The position has been filled," he interrupted. "By a gentleman from Denver. No dependents." Grace felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. "But I've traveled over 1,000 miles. I've sold everything. That's unfortunate, madam, but not the town's concern." He reached into a drawer and withdrew a few coins. "This should cover a night at the boarding house. Beyond that." He shrugged. Grace stared at the meager offering. $3 would hardly cover a decent meal, let alone shelter. But with Abigail watching, she couldn't afford pride. She took the money. Outside, she fought back tears as they walked toward the boarding house. Night was falling, bringing with it the mountain chill. Abigail's small hand felt cold in hers. "Are we going to be the teacher, Mama?" Abigail asked. "No, sweetheart. We're going to find something else." The boarding house turned out to be little more than a glorified saloon with rooms upstairs. The proprietress, a hard-faced woman named Mrs. Winters, eyed Abigail with suspicion. "No children," she declared. "They're noisy and destructive." "Please," Grace begged. "Just for tonight. We'll be gone by morning." After extracting most of Grace's $3, Mrs. Winters relented, leading them to a tiny attic room with a sagging bed and suspicious stains on the floor. "One night," she repeated, before leaving them alone. Grace helped Abigail change into her nightgown, both of them shivering in the unheated room. As she tucked her daughter into bed, Abigail looked up with those solemn eyes that seemed too old for her young face. "Is it because of me that the mayor doesn't want you to be the teacher?" Grace's heart broke. "No, darling, of course not. Mrs. Miller back home said men don't want women with children. She said that's why no one will marry you now." Grace swallowed hard, remembering the gossiping neighbors who'd speculated openly about her prospects after Thomas died. How much had Abigail overheard? "Mrs. Miller doesn't know everything," Grace said, forcing a smile. "Now sleep. Tomorrow will be better." But as Abigail drifted off, Grace sat by the window, watching the saloon across the street fill with rowdy miners and cowboys. In her carpetbag lay exactly $7.26, all that remained of their money. Not enough for train fare back east. Not enough for anything. For the first time since Thomas's death, Grace allowed herself to cry silently into her handkerchief. Mrs. Miller's words echoed in her mind. Was Abigail right? Had she become unworthy of opportunity of love simply because she was a mother? The frontier was harsh enough for a single woman, but for one with a child. A commotion in the street below caught her attention. A tall man on horseback had arrived at the saloon, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Something about his straight posture and the respectful way others greeted him suggested authority. The sheriff, perhaps? Grace turned away. Law enforcement had never been much help to women in her situation. Tomorrow, she would have to find any work, or she and Abigail would be sleeping under the stars. Morning came with the sounds of wagons and livestock in the street. Grace woke Abigail, helping her dress in her second-best dress, the best one having been worn yesterday for their arrival. "Are we going home now?" Abigail asked sleepily. "No, sweetheart. We're going to find work. This is our home now." They descended to the boarding house's small dining room where a few rough-looking men were eating breakfast. All conversation stopped when they entered. "I told you one night," Mrs. Winters said immediately. "You need to be out by 9. "Of course," Grace replied with as much dignity as she could muster. "Might I trouble you for some direction? Is there anyone in town who might need household help?" Mrs. Winters snorted. "Every man in this town needs a woman's touch, but most can't afford it or don't want the bother." One of the miners, an older man with kind eyes, spoke up. "Yorke Harrington at the Diamond H might be hiring. His housekeeper left last month." "Diamond H?" Grace asked. "Biggest ranch in the territory," another man explained. "Harrington's got more cattle than sense, but he pays fair. 5 miles north of town." 5 miles was a long walk, especially for Abigail's small legs, but what choice did they have? "Thank you," Grace said. "We'll try there." After a meager breakfast of coffee for Grace and milk and biscuits for Abigail, depleting another precious dollar, they set out. The road north wound through scrubby hills and ponderosa pines, beautiful but intimidating to eastern eyes. Abigail tried to keep up, but by the second mile Grace was carrying her. By the third, both were exhausted. They rested under a cottonwood tree, sharing their last apple. "Mama, someone's coming," Abigail said suddenly. A cloud of dust approached from the direction they were heading. Grace stood, positioning Abigail slightly behind her. As the rider drew closer, she recognized the tall figure from the previous night. He reined his horse to a stop, a magnificent black stallion that towered over them. The man himself was equally imposing, broad-shouldered and lean-hipped in the way of men who worked hard for a living. His face, now visible beneath his hat, was all angles and planes, weathered by sun and wind. A thin scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into a neatly trimmed beard. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, but there was something compelling about his features. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat. His voice was deep but gentle. "You're a ways from town. Everything all right?" "Yes, thank you," Grace answered, straightening her spine. "We're headed to the Diamond H Ranch. I'm told they might need household help." The man studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes taking in her travel-worn appearance and Abigail's tired face. "That's my ranch," he said finally. "I'm Yorke Harrington." Grace felt a flush of embarrassment. The owner himself, and here she was, dusty and disheveled. "Grace Harper, sir. And this is my daughter, Abigail." Abigail, usually shy around strangers, stepped forward and offered a small curtsy. "How do you do, Mr. Harrington?" Something flickered across Yorke's face, surprise, perhaps, at the child's manners. He dismounted in one fluid motion, revealing his full height, which must have been over 6 feet. "I do well enough, Miss Abigail," he replied, crouching to her level. That's quite a walk for little legs. Would you ladies care for a ride? Grace hesitated. Accepting help from a strange man went against everything she'd been taught, but they were alone on an empty road and he was their potential employer. That's very kind, but please, Mama. Abigail's pleading eyes sealed the decision. Thank you, Mr. Harrington. We would appreciate it. With surprising gentleness, Yorke lifted Abigail onto his saddle, then offered Grace his hand. His palm was calloused but warm against hers as he helped her mount behind Abigail. He took the reins and began leading the horse on foot. You're not from around here, he observed. No, we're from Philadelphia originally, long way from home. This is our home now, Grace said firmly. Yorke glanced back at her, something like respect in his eyes. It's hard country, Mrs. Harper. I'm aware, Mr. Harrington. But we'll manage. They traveled in silence for a while, the rhythm of the horse lulling Abigail into drowsiness. She leaned back against Grace, her small body warm and trusting. Your husband, Yorke asked finally, died last winter. Consumption. He nodded as if that explained everything. Perhaps it did. The Diamond H came into view as they crested a hill, a sprawling ranch house of timber and stone, surrounded by barns, corrals, and bunkhouses. Cattle dotted the distant pastures, and a creek wound through the property like a silver ribbon. It's beautiful, Grace said, unable to hide her awe. It's home, Yorke replied simply. As they approached, ranch hands paused in their work to watch. Grace felt their curious stares and held herself straighter. Yorke led them directly to the main house, helping them dismount with the same care he'd shown earlier. Come inside, he said. We'll talk about why you're here. The interior of the ranch house was unexpectedly refined. Quality furniture, polished floors, and walls adorned with paintings spoke of taste and means. But there were signs of neglect too: dust on the sideboard, dirty dishes in the kitchen sink, and a general air of masculine disorder. Please sit, Yorke gestured to the dining table. Are you hungry? Before Grace could politely decline, Abigail nodded enthusiastically. Yorke's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. He moved to the kitchen with surprising competence, returning with bread, cold meat, and milk. As they ate, he observed them thoughtfully. You said you're looking for household work, he said finally. Grace swallowed her pride along with her bread. Yes, I understand your housekeeper left recently. I'm capable and hardworking. I can cook, clean, mend. Can you raid? The question caught her off guard. Of course. I was to be Silverwater's schoolteacher, but the position was no longer available. Something darkened in Yorke's expression. Cunningham, he muttered. I beg your pardon, Mayor Cunningham. He has particular ideas about who should be teaching our children. Yorke shook his head. His loss, potentially my gain. I need help, Mrs. Harper, that's true, but not just with housekeeping. He rose and went to a bureau, returning with a leather-bound ledger. I need someone who can manage accounts, write correspondence, and yes, keep house. My operation has grown beyond my ability to manage alone, and good help is hard to find, especially those who can read and cipher. Hope fluttered in Grace's chest. I was educated at the ladies' seminary in Philadelphia. I can handle accounts and correspondence. Yorke nodded slowly. And the child, Grace tensed. Abigail is well-behaved and quiet. She won't disturb your work. That wasn't my concern, he said, his eyes moving to Abigail, who was carefully eating her food without spilling a crumb. There's no school nearby. Her education. I would teach her myself, of course. Yorke seemed to come to a decision. Very well. I can offer room and board plus $20 a month. There's a small cottage behind the main house. My foreman lived there before building his own place. It would suit you and your daughter. $20 was more than Grace had dared hope for. It would allow them to save to build a future. but she had to be certain. "Mr. Harrington, I should be clear. My daughter comes first in all things. If she needs me, I must attend to her." "I wouldn't expect otherwise," he replied, something unreadable crossing his face. "Do we have an agreement?" Grace extended her hand. "We do." His large hand enveloped hers, warm and strong. For a brief moment, something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, of shared determination. "Welcome to Diamond H, Mrs. Harper." The cottage exceeded Grace's expectations. Though small, it was clean and sound, with 2 bedrooms, a sitting area, and a tiny kitchen. Previous occupants had left basic furnishings: beds, a table, chairs, and a bookshelf with a few forgotten volumes. "It's perfect," Grace told Yorke, who had personally shown them to their new home. "When would you like me to begin?" "Tomorrow is soon enough. Get settled today." After he left, Grace and Abigail explored their new surroundings. The cottage overlooked a small garden, overgrown but salvageable. Beyond that lay a creek where cottonwoods provided shade. "Can this be our forever home, Mama?" Abigail asked, her face more animated than Grace had seen in months. "We'll see, darling. For now, it's a very good beginning." That night, as Abigail slept peacefully in her new bed, Grace allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. Perhaps here, miles from the judgmental eyes of society, she and Abigail could build something lasting. Mr. Harrington seemed fair if reserved. The work would be demanding but dignified. For the first time since Thomas's death, Grace slept without fear of tomorrow. She woke before dawn, an old habit from her teaching days. After dressing in her most practical dress and tying her auburn hair back severely, she roused Abigail. "You'll be good today while I work?" she asked, helping Abigail into her clothes. "Yes, Mama. Can I bring my doll?" "Of course. And your primer. We'll continue your lessons when I have time." They walked to the main house as the first light crept over the eastern hills. Smoke already rose from the chimney, and through the window, Grace could see Yorke moving about the kitchen. He greeted them at the door, coffee cup in hand. "You're early." "Better than late," Grace replied. Something like amusement crossed his face. "Indeed, come in." Over a breakfast of Yorke's, making surprisingly edible biscuits and bacon, he outlined Grace's duties. She would manage the household accounts, order supplies, handle correspondence, and oversee the cleaning and cooking. It was more responsibility than she'd anticipated, almost like managing a small business. "You're sure I'm qualified?" she asked. "Mrs. Harper, I suspect you're overqualified," Yorke replied. "But I pay for competence, and you strike me as extremely competent." It was, perhaps, the nicest compliment she'd received in years. The first weeks at Diamond H established a rhythm. Grace rose early, prepared breakfast for herself and Abigail, then walked to the main house. While she worked on accounts or correspondence, Abigail quietly played or practiced her letters. In the afternoons, Grace cleaned or cooked, teaching Abigail simple household tasks along the way. Yorke was often absent, riding out at dawn to work with his men and returning late. When their paths crossed, their interactions were cordial but brief. He was unfailingly polite to Abigail, always acknowledging her with the same respect he showed adults, but there was a guardedness about him that Grace couldn't penetrate. One evening, about a month into their stay, Grace was preparing dinner when Yorke returned earlier than usual. She heard him speaking to someone on the porch and was surprised when he entered with Abigail in tow. "Your daughter was at the creek," he explained, his expression unreadable. "Alone." Grace's heart dropped. "Abigail, you know you're not to go there without me." "I'm sorry, Mama," Abigail said, her lower lip trembling. "I was following a butterfly." Grace knelt before her daughter. "You could have fallen in or gotten lost. Promise me you won't wander off again." "I promise." Grace looked up at Yorke, expecting disapproval, but his face had softened. "No harm done," he said. "But the creek can be dangerous after rain. Perhaps we should set clearer boundaries." "We will. Thank you for bringing her back." He nodded, turning to leave, but Abigail's voice stopped him. "Mr. Harrington, did you ever catch butterflies when you were little?" A shadow passed over his face. "Once. Long ago." Something in his tone made Grace curious, but she knew better than to pry. There were wounds in everyone's past, and Yorke Harrington's were his own. That night, Grace braided Abigail's hair before bed, a nightly ritual they both cherished. "Mr. Harrington seems sad sometimes," Abigail observed. Grace's fingers stilled momentarily. "Does he? I hadn't noticed." "His eyes get far away, like he's looking at something nobody else can see." "Perhaps he's just thinking about his ranch," Grace suggested, resuming the braiding. "No," Abigail said with the certainty only children possess. "It's a sad thing, I can tell." Grace tied off the braid with a ribbon. "Well, it's not our place to ask about it." "Everyone has private feelings, Abigail. Like how you cry sometimes at night when you think I'm asleep." Grace froze, then gathered her daughter into a tight embrace. "Yes, like that. But I'm not sad now. I'm happy we're here." "Me too," Abigail murmured against her shoulder. "And I think Mr. Harrington is nicer than he wants people to know." With that childish wisdom hanging in the air, Abigail drifted to sleep, leaving Grace to wonder about the man who had given them sanctuary. The following day brought unexpected visitors to Diamond H. Grace was in the study sorting mail when she heard the sound of carriage wheels. Looking out the window, she saw an elegant buggy approaching, driven by a well-dressed man. Beside him sat a woman in a fashionable dress, her parasol tilted to shield her fair complexion. Yorke, who had been reviewing cattle records with Grace, tensed visibly. "Is something wrong?" Grace asked. "Judge Blackwell and his daughter," he said, his jaw tight. "They weren't expected." Before Grace could respond, he was striding toward the door. She remained in the study, unsure if she should make herself scarce, but curiosity kept her near the window. The judge was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, with silver hair and an authoritative bearing. His daughter appeared to be in her mid-20s, beautiful in a calculated way, with elaborately styled blonde hair and a dress that must have come from Denver or even San Francisco. Through the open window, Grace heard their exchange. "Yorke." "What a pleasant surprise to find you at home," the young woman said, extending a gloved hand. "Miss Blackwell, Judge." Yorke's voice was polite but cool as he helped them down from the buggy. "What brings you to Diamond H?" "We were returning from Silverwater and thought we'd pay a social call," the judge replied. "Victoria has been quite insistent about checking on your welfare." "My welfare is excellent, as you can see." Victoria Blackwell laughed, a practiced sound. "So gruff." "Truly, Yorke, we came because Father has news about the railroad spur. They're considering routing it through the eastern edge of your property." Yorke's posture changed subtly. "Is that so? Perhaps we should discuss this inside." As they moved toward the house, Grace retreated from the window. She busied herself organizing papers, trying to look professional when they entered. "Oh," Victoria stopped short at the sight of Grace. "I didn't realize you had company." Yorke's expression remained neutral. "Mrs. Harper is my household manager and bookkeeper." "Mrs. Harper, Judge Blackwell and his daughter, Miss Victoria Blackwell." Grace offered a polite curtsy. "Sir, Miss Blackwell. A pleasure." The judge nodded cordially, but Victoria's eyes narrowed as they assessed Grace from head to toe, lingering on her simple work dress and practical hairstyle. "How progressive of you, Yorke," Victoria said with a tight smile, "employing a woman for business matters." "Mrs. Harper is exceptionally qualified," Yorke replied. "Would you care for refreshments after your journey?" Grace took the hint. "I'll prepare some tea." In the kitchen, she quickly assembled a tea tray, adding some freshly baked cookies she'd made that morning. When she returned to the study, the conversation had taken on a tense quality. "Consider my offer," the judge was saying. "The railroad would increase your property value tenfold. Selling now would be the prudent choice." "I'm not interested in selling, Judge, not even a portion." Victoria's laugh tinkled like breaking glass. "Oh, Yorke, you're so stubborn. What will you do with all this land? You need a wife, children to inherit this empire you're building." Grace set down the tea tray, feeling suddenly intrusive. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper," Yorke said, his eyes meeting hers briefly. "That will be all for now." Dismissed, Grace nodded and left, but not before catching Victoria's calculating gaze. Later, after the Blackwells had departed, Grace found Yorke on the porch staring out at the distant mountains. She hesitated, then approached with the mail that had arrived that morning. "There's a letter from the cattle broker in Denver," she said. He accepted it without looking at it. "They want my land," he said abruptly. "The Blackwells. They've been trying to buy it for years." Grace wasn't sure how to respond. "It's beautiful land." "It's more than that." He finally turned to her, his gray eyes intense. "This ranch was wilderness when I came here. Every fence post, every building, I built it from nothing. Some things can't be measured in dollars." "I understand," Grace said softly. "Some things are beyond price." Something shifted in Yorke's expression, surprise perhaps, that she comprehended so readily. "The judge's daughter seems interested in more than your land," Grace ventured, immediately regretting her boldness. To her surprise, Yorke laughed, a genuine sound she'd rarely heard from him. "Victoria Blackwell is interested in becoming the wealthiest woman in the territory. I'm merely a means to that end." "You don't care for her." "I admire her determination," he said diplomatically. "But no, Mrs. Harper, my heart remains unengaged." The phrase, so formal and yet revealing, hung between them. For a moment, Grace saw him not as her employer but as a man, lonely perhaps, driven certainly, but with depths she was only beginning to glimpse. The moment broke when Abigail came running around the corner of the house, her hair escaping its morning braids. "Mama, look what I found." She held up a perfect blue jay feather. "It's beautiful, darling, but you're a mess." Grace knelt to fix Abigail's hair, acutely aware of Yorke watching them. "Your hair is coming undone," he observed to Abigail. Abigail nodded solemnly. "Mama braids it every night, but it never stays." "Perhaps you need a better technique," Yorke said, then surprised both Harper women by continuing, "I could show you." Grace's hand stilled in Abigail's hair. "You know how to braid hair?" A shadow crossed his face. "I did once." Before Grace could respond, one of the ranch hands approached, needing Yorke's attention for some emergency with the cattle. He excused himself, leaving Grace to wonder about his unexpected offer and the story behind it. That evening, as Grace prepared dinner in the main house, a thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains. Lightning split the sky, and rain lashed against the windows. Abigail, who had always feared storms, pressed close to Grace's side. "We should head back to the cottage before it worsens," Grace said, more to herself than to Abigail. "You'll do no such thing," Yorke said, entering the kitchen. He was soaked through, having just come from checking the livestock. "The creek will be rising. You'll stay here tonight." Grace wanted to protest. Staying overnight in her employer's home seemed improper, but one look at the deluge outside convinced her. "Thank you. Will be no trouble." "I'm scared," Abigail whispered as thunder boomed overhead. To Grace's astonishment, Yorke crouched down to Abigail's level. "Would you like to know a secret about thunder?" he asked, his voice gentler than Grace had ever heard it. Abigail nodded, her eyes wide. "It's just the sky moving furniture," he said, "making room for new stars." "Really?" "My mother told me that when I was about your age," he said, something wistful in his tone. "I've never found a better explanation." Grace felt her heart constrict at this glimpse of the boy Yorke must have been. They ate dinner by lamplight as the storm raged, Yorke sharing simple stories of ranch life that made Abigail giggle despite her fear. When it was time for bed, he showed them to a guest room with a large 4-poster bed. "Will you be all right?" he asked, lingering at the doorway. "We'll be fine," Grace assured him. "Thank you for your kindness." He nodded, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary before he turned away. Later, as Grace brushed out Abigail's hair before bed, her daughter's question caught her off guard. "You like Mr. Harrington, Mama?" Grace's hands faltered. "He's a good employer. But do you like him? As a person, I suppose I do," Grace admitted. "He's been very kind to us." Abigail nodded as if confirming something to herself. "I think he's lonely." "What makes you say that?" "His house is too big for just one person. And sometimes he looks at us like he wishes he could keep us." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "That's just your imagination, darling." But later, lying beside her sleeping daughter in the unfamiliar bed, Grace found herself pondering Abigail's words. There was something in Yorke Harrington that called to her a solidity, a quiet strength that reminded her of what she'd loved in Thomas. But also something entirely his own, a complexity that intrigued her despite her best efforts to maintain professional distance. It was foolish, of course. She was his employee, a widow with a young child, hardly the sort of woman a man like Yorke would consider as more than a convenient housekeeper. Victoria Blackwell, with her fine clothes and family connections, was surely more his equal. Besides, Grace reminded herself, she had Abigail to consider. Her daughter must come first always. Romance was a luxury she could ill afford. With that sensible thought, she drifted into sleep, unaware that downstairs, Yorke Harrington sat before the dying fire, thinking of auburn hair and steady green eyes that saw more than he intended to reveal. Morning brought clear skies and a creek swollen beyond its banks, confirming Yorke's wisdom in keeping them at the main house. After breakfast, he insisted on escorting them back to the cottage to check for any storm damage. The path was muddy, forcing them to pick their way carefully. When they reached a particularly soggy stretch, Yorke lifted Abigail onto his shoulders without ceremony. "Hold tight," he instructed, his hands steady on her small legs. Abigail giggled with delight at her new vantage point. "I can see everything from up here." Grace watched them, something warm unfurling in her chest at the sight of her daughter perched so comfortably atop the tall cowboy's shoulders. It was the most natural thing in the world, and yet it made her throat tight with emotion. The cottage had weathered the storm intact, though a small leak in the roof had left a puddle on the floor. "I'll fix that today," Yorke promised, carefully setting Abigail down. "You don't need to trouble yourself," Grace protested. "I'm sure you have more important matters." "Nothing more important than keeping you dry," he replied, then seemed to catch himself. "Both of you, that is. Can't have my bookkeeper catching pneumonia." The moment turned awkward, both adults suddenly aware of boundaries being tested. "Thank you," Grace said finally. "We appreciate everything you've done." Yorke nodded, his expression once again unreadable, and took his leave. Later that afternoon, true to his word, he returned with tools and materials to repair the roof. Grace watched from the garden as he worked, his movements efficient and precise. There was nothing of the pampered rancher about Yorke Harrington. He worked as hard as any of his men. When he finished, he found Grace in the garden, attempting to restore order to the storm-ravaged plants. "The roof should hold now," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Where's Abigail?" "Napping." The excitement of the storm wore her out. He nodded, then gestured to her gardening efforts. You like growing things. I do. There's something hopeful about planting seeds, watching them become something beautiful or useful. My mother felt the same, he said, the words seeming to surprise him as much as her. She had a garden back in Kansas. Nothing would grow in that soil, but she never gave up trying. She sounds determined. She was. His voice softened. Like you. Grace felt a blush rising and turned back to her work. What brought you to Colorado, Mr. Harrington? He was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, a need to start fresh, to build something that was entirely mine. And have you built what you wanted? His gray eyes met hers, revealing more than perhaps he intended. Parts of it. The answer hung between them, laden with meaning neither was ready to examine. I should check on Abigail, Grace said, retreating to safer ground. Yorke nodded. Of course, and Mrs. Harper. My offer still stands. Offer to show Abigail a better braiding technique, if you'd permit it. The request was so unexpected, so oddly personal that Grace could only nod. I'm sure she'd like that. That evening, after dinner in their cottage, there was a knock at the door. Yorke stood on the threshold, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. Is it a good time? He asked. Grace invited him in, aware of how small and humble the cottage must seem compared to his grand house. But Yorke seemed at ease, greeting Abigail warmly. Your mother tells me you might like to learn a special way to braid hair, he said, settling into a chair. Abigail nodded eagerly. Can you really do hair, Mr. Harrington? I can. Sit here in front of me. Grace watched, fascinated as Yorke's large, work-roughened hands moved with surprising gentleness through Abigail's auburn curls. His fingers wove the strands into an intricate pattern, his brow furrowed in concentration. Where did you learn to do this? Grace asked softly. Pain flashed across his face, so brief she might have imagined it. I had a sister, he said, his focus on Abigail's hair. Emma. She was about Abigail's age when our mother died. There was no one else to help her with such things. I'm sorry, Grace said, understanding now the shadows that sometimes haunted his eyes. Is she? Gone, he said simply. 15 years now. Abigail, sensing the shift in mood, reached back to pat Yorke's hand. My papa is gone too, she said, but Mama says he watches over us from heaven. Yorke's hands stilled momentarily, then resumed their work. I'm sure he does, he said, his voice rough with emotion. When he finished, Abigail's hair was woven in a complex braid that put Grace's simple efforts to shame. It's beautiful, Grace said, genuinely impressed. I'd never have guessed you possessed such a talent. Not much call for it on a cattle ranch, he replied with a small smile. But some skills you don't forget. Before leaving, he showed Grace the technique, his hands occasionally brushing hers as he demonstrated. Each contact sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the summer evening. Thank you, she said at the door. You've made Abigail very happy. She's a special child, he replied, his eyes lingering on Grace's face. She reminds me of better times. With that cryptic remark, he bid them good night and walked back toward the main house, his tall figure silhouetted against the twilight sky. That night, as Grace brushed her own hair before bed, she found herself thinking of large, gentle hands and gray eyes that had seen too much sorrow. For the first time since Thomas's death, she allowed herself to wonder if perhaps her heart wasn't as firmly sealed as she'd believed. The weeks that followed brought subtle changes to life at Diamond H. Yorke began taking his evening meals with Grace and Abigail in their cottage, instead of alone in the big house. He made a point of spending time with Abigail, teaching her to identify birds and wildflowers, sometimes even letting her accompany him on short rides around the ranch. With Grace, too, his reserve gradually melted. Their working relationship evolved into something warmer, more personal. He sought her opinions not just on ranch business, but on books they'd both read, on politics, on the future of the territory. He listened when she spoke, truly listened, in a way few men had ever done. Grace found herself looking forward to their conversations, to the quiet moments when they might sit on the porch after Abigail was asleep, watching the stars emerge over the mountains. She told him of her life in Philadelphia, of Thomas's gentle scholarly nature, of her dreams of teaching. He shared stories of building the ranch, of cattle drives and harsh winters, of the satisfaction of creating something from nothing. But always, there remained parts of himself he kept hidden. He never spoke of his family beyond the brief mention of his sister and mother. He deflected questions about his life before Colorado, and sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, that old sadness would shadow his face. One afternoon in late summer, Grace was working in the study when Victoria Blackwell arrived unannounced. Yorke was out with the men, moving cattle to higher pasture before the first frost. "Mrs. Harper," Victoria said, sweeping into the room in a rustle of expensive silk. "How fortunate." "I was hoping for a private word." Grace stood, acutely aware of her work dress and ink-stained fingers compared to Victoria's immaculate appearance. "Miss Blackwell, Mr. Harrington is away at present. I'm aware. That's why I came now." Victoria removed her gloves slowly, her eyes never leaving Grace's face. "I wanted to speak with you, woman to woman." Unease prickled along Grace's spine. "Of course. May I offer you tea?" "This isn't a social call," Victoria said, her pleasant tone at odds with the coldness in her eyes. "I'll be direct. Your situation here is becoming problematic. I don't understand. Don't you? A young widow living on a bachelor's property, spending evenings alone with him. People talk, Mrs. Harper, even in the wilderness." Grace felt heat rise to her face. "There has been nothing improper between Mr. Harrington and myself. I am his employee." Victoria's laugh was brittle. "Perhaps that's how it began, but I've seen how he looks at you and your daughter. It's affecting his judgment regarding matters of importance." "What matters?" "Business matters. Personal matters." Victoria stepped closer. "Let me be clear. Yorke Harrington will never marry a woman like you. He may be enjoying your company for now, but when the time comes for him to choose a wife, he will select someone who can enhance his position, not hinder it. Someone without complications." The words struck Grace like physical blows, echoing her deepest insecurities. "I have never presumed. Good. Then we understand each other." Victoria pulled her gloves back on with deliberate care. "I would hate to see you and your daughter homeless again if things should become awkward." With that parting shot, she swept out, leaving Grace shaking with anger and humiliation. The worst part was that Victoria had merely articulated what Grace herself had thought countless times. A man like Yorke needed a wife of status and refinement, not a penniless widow with a child. Abigail. Everything always came back to Abigail, her precious daughter whom Grace would protect at any cost. If staying at Diamond H might somehow harm Abigail's future. By the time Yorke returned that evening, Grace had composed herself, but something had changed. She was quieter, more formal, maintaining a careful distance that he clearly noticed but didn't understand. "Is everything all right?" he asked as they went over the week's accounts. "Perfectly fine," she replied, not meeting his eyes. "The feed order from Denver arrived today. I've recorded it here." He studied her for a long moment. Grace. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it nearly broke her resolve. "Yes, Mr. Harrington." His jaw tightened at her deliberate formality. "Something's happened. Tell me." "Nothing has happened. I'm simply remembering my place." "Your place?" Confusion and hurt flashed across his face. "I don't understand." Grace gathered her papers, needing to escape before her emotions betrayed her. It's late. Abigail will be waiting. Grace, wait, but she was already gone, hurrying back to the cottage where she could compose herself before facing her daughter. The following days were tense. Grace performed her duties impeccably, but withdrew emotionally, rebuffing Yorke's attempts at their usual conversations. He watched her with confusion that gradually hardened into a distant politeness that matched her own. Abigail noticed the change immediately. "Why doesn't Mr. Harrington come for dinner anymore?" she asked one evening. "He's very busy with the ranch," Grace replied, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. "Did you have a fight?" "No, darling. Sometimes adults just need space." "I miss him," Abigail said plaintively. "He was teaching me about the constellations." Grace's heart ached. In her determination to protect Abigail from future pain, she was causing immediate hurt. But wasn't short-term discomfort better than allowing her daughter to form deeper attachments to a man who could never truly be part of their family? Victoria's words haunted her. "Yorke Harrington will never marry a woman like you." A week after Victoria's visit, Grace was in the garden harvesting the last of the summer vegetables when she heard approaching hoofbeats. Looking up, she saw Yorke returning with several of his men. They were riding hard, and even from a distance, she could tell something was wrong. Setting aside her basket, she hurried toward the main house, arriving just as Yorke dismounted. His face was grim, his shirt torn and bloodied at the shoulder. "What happened?" she asked, professional distance forgotten in her concern. "Rustlers," he said tersely. "They hit the north pasture. We drove them off, but not before they stampeded part of the herd into Blackwell land." One of the men spat into the dirt. "Convenient, that." Yorke silenced him with a look. "Get the doctor for me, Gell. The bullet went clean through, but it needs proper tending." As the men dispersed, Grace stepped closer. "You're hurt." He glanced at his shoulder as if noticing the wound for the first time. "It's just a graze." "Let me see." For a moment she thought he would refuse, maintaining the distance she had imposed between them. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, he followed her into the house. In the kitchen, Grace gathered clean cloths and water. Yorke sat heavily in a chair, the events of the day etched in the lines of his face. "Remove your shirt," she instructed, her tone professional despite the intimacy of the request. He complied without comment, wincing slightly as the fabric pulled away from the wound. Grace inhaled sharply at the sight of his bare torso, not just at the angry red furrow along his shoulder where the bullet had grazed him, but at the map of old scars that crisscrossed his back and chest. "You've been shot before," she observed, gently cleaning the wound. "And knifed. And kicked by horses." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I've lived an eventful life." Grace worked in silence for a moment, trying to ignore the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers, the solid strength of him so close. "Do you think the rustlers were connected to Judge Blackwell?" Yorke's eyes met hers, surprise evident in their gray depths. "Why would you think that?" "The timing seems suspicious. And Miss Blackwell visited last week alone," his brow furrowed. "Victoria was here. You didn't mention it." "It didn't seem important." Grace focused on bandaging his shoulder, avoiding his gaze. "She made it clear that she has expectations regarding your relationship." Understanding dawned on his face. "That's why you've been distant. What exactly did she say to you?" "Nothing that wasn't true," Grace replied, securing the bandage. "She merely reminded me of realities I'd chosen to ignore." Yorke caught her wrist as she moved to step away. "What realities, Grace?" The warmth of his touch, the intensity of his gaze, it was too much. Weeks of suppressed emotion welled up, threatening to overflow. "That I am your employee, that you are a man of property and standing, that Abigail and I are complications you don't need." His grip tightened, not painfully but urgently. "Is that what you believe?" That you and Abigail are complications, aren't we? A respectable rancher doesn't court his housekeeper, especially one with a child. Eventually, you'll marry someone like Victoria Blackwell, someone who brings connections and advantages, not burdens. Is that what Victoria told you? Anger flashed in his eyes. And you believed her? I believed the truth I already knew, Grace said, finally pulling her wrist free. Mr. Harrington, Yorke, he interrupted. My name is Yorke, and you've been using it for weeks until Victoria poisoned your mind with her schemes. They're not schemes if they're reality, Grace insisted. You need a wife who can stand beside you in society, who can help you build your empire. Not someone who what? Who manages my accounts better than I ever could. Who brings warmth and life to a house that was just walls and furniture before. Who raises a daughter so kind and bright she makes everyone around her better. Grace stared at him, speechless. Did it never occur to you, he continued more softly, that perhaps I was the one unworthy of you? Before she could respond, the door burst open and Abigail rushed in, her face alight with excitement. Mama, Mr. Yorke, there's a wagon coming with ladies and children. Grace and Yorke moved to the window. Sure enough, a large wagon was approaching, loaded with women and children of various ages. The new schoolteacher and her family, Yorke explained. I forgot they were arriving today. Schoolteacher, Grace repeated. Silverwater finally decided they needed one after all. He glanced at her. They're staying here tonight before continuing to town tomorrow. Grace nodded, professional mask firmly back in place despite the turmoil within. I'll prepare rooms and dinner. Grace, Yorke began, but she was already moving away, gathering herself for the task of hospitality. The arrival of the Petersons, Reverend Peterson, his wife, their 5 children, and his sister Martha. The new teacher provided a welcome distraction from the tension between Grace and Yorke. The main house filled with noise and activity as beds were prepared. Food was served, and travel stories were shared. Martha Peterson was a sensible woman in her 30s who immediately took to Grace. Mr. Harrington tells me you were originally hired to be Silverwater's teacher, she said as they washed dishes after dinner. Yes, but circumstances changed, Grace replied, conscious of Yorke conversing with the Reverend nearby. A shame, Martha said. The town council mentioned there had been another candidate. They didn't say why they changed their minds. I have a daughter, Grace said simply. Understanding dawned in Martha's kind eyes. I see. Well, their loss is Mr. Harrington's gain, I should think. Later, as the children played together in the yard, Abigail, delighted to have companions her own age, Martha approached Grace again. I've been thinking, she said. The school in Silverwater needs an assistant. The enrollment is larger than expected, and I can't manage all the grades alone. Would you consider it? Grace's heart leaped at the thought of teaching again, but reality quickly tempered her excitement. I have commitments here, and the town council would answer to me, Martha finished firmly. I need a qualified assistant, and you need to use your education. As for your daughter, she would attend school with the others, of course. The offer was tempting, a chance to pursue her calling, to be independent again. But as Grace glanced across the yard to where Yorke was showing the children how to throw a lasso, her heart constricted. Despite everything, the thought of leaving Diamond H, of leaving him, was painful in ways she hadn't anticipated. May I think about it? She asked. Of course. But not too long. Term starts in 2 weeks. That night, after the guests had retired and Abigail was asleep in a makeshift bed in the sewing room, Grace found herself alone on the porch. The conversation with Yorke, interrupted by Abigail's announcement, weighed heavily on her mind. Had he truly meant what he said? That he considered himself unworthy of her? The sound of the door opening behind her broke into her thoughts. Yorke stepped out, his tall figure silhouetted against the lamplight from within. "You should be resting," she said. "Your shoulder will heal," he finished, moving to stand beside her at the railing. "Miss Peterson offered you a position. It wasn't a question. You were listening. I make it my business to know what happens on my ranch." He turned to face her. "Will you take it?" Grace studied the shadowed planes of his face, trying to read his thoughts. "I don't know. It's what I trained for, what I came west to do." "And is it what you want now?" The question hung between them, layered with meaning beyond the immediate topic. "I want what's best for Abigail," Grace said finally. "A mother must think of her child first." "And what about Grace? What does she want?" No one had asked her that in so long, not since Thomas had proposed, asking if a quiet, scholarly life would make her happy. She had said yes then, and it had been true. But now, "I want." She faltered, then gathered her courage. "I want not to be seen as a burden. I want Abigail to grow up knowing her mother is respected, not pitied or judged. I want me," Yorke said quietly. "At least, I hope you do." "Because I want you, Grace. You and Abigail both." She stared at him, heart pounding. "Yorke, let me finish," he said, taking her hands in his. "I've never been good with words. Action has always come easier, but you deserve words, so I'll try." He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "I was married once, very young, back in Kansas. Her name was Sarah. We had a daughter." Grace felt the world tilt slightly. "You have a child," pain crossed his face. "Had cholera took them both, along with my sister, in the same terrible week. I was 19, suddenly alone, with nothing but guilt that I had survived when they hadn't." "Oh, Yorke," Grace whispered, understanding now the shadows that haunted him, the reason he sometimes looked at Abigail with such mingled joy and sorrow. "I came west to outrun the memories," he continued. "Built this place thinking if I worked hard enough I could forget. But I was just existing, not living, until you and Abigail arrived." His grip on her hands tightened. "You think you're a complication, a burden. Grace, you're the opposite. You've brought life back to this ranch, to me. And Abigail," his voice roughened, "that child of yours has healed parts of me I thought were dead forever." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. "But Victoria said—" "Victoria Blackwell wants this land, not me," he interrupted. "Her father has been trying to buy Diamond H for years. When that failed, they decided marriage was the next best option. But I've never encouraged her, never wanted her. She's beautiful, from a good family. She's cold and calculating," Yorke said flatly. "And she's not you." With gentle fingers, he brushed a tear from Grace's cheek. "I love you, Grace Harper. I love your strength, your intelligence, your fierce devotion to your daughter. I love the way you challenge me, the way you've made this place a home. And I love Abigail as if she were my own." Grace could hardly breathe through the emotion constricting her chest. "But people will talk. They'll say you married beneath you, that I trapped you somehow. Let them talk," he said fiercely. "I don't give a damn what anyone thinks except you and Abigail. But if you truly want to teach, if that's where your heart lies, I won't stand in your way. I want your happiness above all else." "My happiness," Grace repeated softly, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the truth. "My happiness is here, Yorke, with you. It has been for some time." His smile then was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head and kissed her. His lips were warm and tender against hers, and Grace felt something within her unfurl and bloom. When they parted, both were breathing unevenly. "Marry me," he whispered against her lips. "Be my wife. Let me be a father to Abigail. Let us be a family." "Yes," Grace answered without hesitation. "Yes to all of it." A small sound from the doorway made them turn. Abigail stood there in her nightgown, her eyes wide. "Are you going to be my new papa?" she asked Yorke directly. He crossed to her and knelt, bringing himself to her level. "If that's something you would want, Abigail, I would be honored to be your papa, but only if you say it's all right." Abigail considered this with serious deliberation. "Would you still braid my hair?" A smile broke across Yorke's face. "Every night if you want. And teach me about stars, all of them, and can I help with the horses when you're a bit older?" Abigail nodded, decision made. "Then I think you should marry Mama." She looked at Grace. "Don't you think so, Mama?" Grace joined them, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "I do, darling, I really do." Yorke gathered them both into his arms, and for the first time since Thomas's death, Grace felt the pieces of her broken world sliding back into place differently than before, but perhaps even stronger for having been rebuilt. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at Diamond H. Reverend Peterson returned from Silverwater to officiate, and Martha Peterson stood as Grace's witness. Abigail served as flower girl, her hair elaborately braided by Yorke himself that morning. The Blackwells, unsurprisingly, declined their invitation. As autumn turned to winter, the little family settled into a rhythm of their own making. Grace continued to manage the ranch accounts, but also began teaching Abigail and the children of the ranch hands 3 mornings a week. Yorke taught her to ride, and soon she was accompanying him on shorter trips around the property. Abigail blossomed under Yorke's devoted attention. He built her a swing in the cottonwood by the creek, carved her tiny wooden animals, and, true to his word, braided her hair each night before bed. In return, she filled his days with laughter and questions and unconditional love. One evening in early spring, Grace found them sitting on the porch steps, Abigail nestled against Yorke's side as he pointed out constellations in the darkening sky. "And that one?" Abigail asked, pointing. "That's Orion the hunter," Yorke explained. "See his belt, 3 stars in a row." "Was he a cowboy like you?" Yorke chuckled. "Not exactly, but he was brave and strong." "Like you," Abigail said with certainty. Grace watched them from the doorway, her heart full. At 7 years old, Abigail had already forgotten the time before Yorke, when it had been just the 2 of them against the world. She saw nothing strange in having gained a father who adored her, in living on a ranch instead of in a city row house. And perhaps that was as it should be. Children adapted, embraced change, found joy in the present without dwelling on the past. It was adults who struggled, who doubted, who let fear of judgment cloud their happiness. Grace moved to join them on the steps, and Yorke's arm immediately encircled her waist, drawing her close. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his breath warm against her temple. "That I'm grateful," she replied honestly, "for all of it, even the hard parts that brought us here." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "I was just telling Abigail about the stars. Care to learn about Orion?" "I already know about him," Grace said, leaning into her husband's strength. "But I'd like to hear your version." As Yorke's deep voice wove the ancient tale, Grace gazed at the stars scattered across the vast Colorado sky. How strange life was, how unexpected its turns. A year ago, she had believed herself unworthy of love, burdened by her responsibilities as a mother. Now she understood that Abigail had never been her limitation, but her greatest gift, the child who had led her to this place, this man, this life. Abigail yawned, nestling closer between them. "I'm sleepy, Papa." "Time for bed then, little stargazer," Yorke said, rising and lifting her effortlessly into his arms. Grace followed them inside, watching as Yorke gently laid Abigail in her bed. With practiced hands he unbraided her hair, spreading the auburn waves across the pillow. "Story?" Abigail asked drowsily. "Just a short one," Yorke agreed, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Once there was a lonely cowboy who thought his heart was empty forever. Then one day, a beautiful woman and her daughter arrived at his ranch and everything changed. Grace slipped away, giving them their moment. In the kitchen, she put the kettle on for tea, listening to the murmur of Yorke's voice from the bedroom, occasionally interrupted by Abigail's questions. This was happiness, she realized. Not grand passions or dramatic gestures, but these quiet moments of connection. A family built not from obligation but from choice. Love that encompassed not just two hearts but three. When Yorke joined her a few minutes later, his expression was thoughtful. "She's asleep," he said, accepting the cup of tea Grace offered. "She wanted to know if we could have a baby brother or sister for her to teach things to." Grace nearly dropped her own cup. She did. Yorke's eyes held hers, warm with love and something like hope. "I told her that was a decision for Mama and Papa to make together, but that I thought it was a fine idea." Grace set down her cup carefully. "And what do you think?" "Truly," he came to her then, drawing her into his arms. "I think I want everything with you, Grace. A dozen children if that's what you desire, or just our Abigail if that's enough. I just want you to be happy." "I am happy," she whispered against his chest. "Happier than I ever imagined possible." She drew back slightly to look up at him. "But I think perhaps Abigail is right. This family has room to grow." His smile then was like sunshine after rain. "Are you saying that I want another child?" "Yes." Grace touched his face, tracing the scar along his jaw that she now knew had come from his first cattle drive. "A son with your eyes, perhaps. Or another daughter for you to braid hair for." Yorke lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, his eyes dark with love and desire. "Then I suggest we retire early this evening, Mrs. Harrington." "An excellent suggestion, Mr. Harrington," Grace replied, laughing as he carried her toward their bedroom. Later, as they lay entwined in the darkness, Yorke's fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Not taking the teaching position in town?" Grace considered the question seriously. "No. I love teaching our little school here, but more than that, I love our life together. This is where I belong. From the moment I saw you on that road, exhausted but determined with Abigail in tow, something in me recognized you," Yorke confessed. "As if my heart knew you before my mind did." "I was so afraid," Grace admitted. "Not of you, but of what you made me feel. After Thomas died, I locked away that part of myself. I was Abigail's mother, nothing more. I couldn't afford to be a woman with desires and dreams. And now," she pressed a kiss to his chest, right over his heart. "Now I'm everything: mother, wife, teacher, lover. I'm whole again, Yorke. You and Abigail make me whole." Their second child, a boy they named Thomas Yorke Harrington, was born the following winter during a magnificent snowstorm. Abigail, now 8, appointed herself his official protector and teacher, solemnly explaining the world to her infant brother. "Papa will teach you about stars and horses," Grace overheard her telling the baby one afternoon. "And Mama will teach you reading and numbers, and I'll teach you everything else." Yorke, coming to stand beside Grace in the nursery doorway, slipped an arm around her waist. "She's going to be a formidable teacher someday." "Like her mother," Grace teased. "More like her father," Yorke replied with a grin. "Stubborn and opinionated," Grace laughed, leaning into his strength. "I can't argue with that assessment." As Diamond H. prospered, so did the Harrington family. Over the years, 2 more children joined them, twin girls who inherited their mother's auburn hair and their father's gray eyes. The little school Grace had started grew to serve all the children within riding distance, eventually becoming a proper schoolhouse with Grace as its headmistress. Yorke never lost his habit of braiding his daughter's hair each night, the tender ritual a testament to the man behind the successful rancher, a man who had found healing through loving a woman who once thought her child made her unworthy of love. And Grace, who had arrived in Colorado with nothing but $7 and a desperate hope, found herself rich beyond measure in all the ways that truly mattered. On their 10th anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard, Yorke took Grace's hand in his. "Do you remember what you told me that night I asked you to marry me?" he asked. "About being grateful for even the hard parts that brought us together." Grace nodded, her eyes on their oldest daughter as she patiently showed her little brother how to make a daisy chain. "I think about that often," Yorke continued. "How close we came to never meeting. If Thomas hadn't died, if the teaching position hadn't fallen through, if I hadn't ridden out that day and found you on the road. But you did," Grace said simply. "All those terrible things led to something beautiful. That's the mystery of life, I suppose." Yorke lifted her hand to his lips. "No, that's the miracle of you, Grace Harrington. You took a broken man and a lonely ranch and turned them into a home. You saw worth where others saw burden. You loved when it would have been easier to close your heart." "As did you," she reminded him. "You saw a woman and child in need, not complications to avoid." He smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. "Best decision I ever made." As the sun set over Diamond H Ranch, painting the Colorado sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace Harrington looked at the life she had built with Yorke, their 4 beautiful children, their thriving ranch, their deep and abiding love. From the ashes of loss, they had forged something precious and enduring. And it had all begun with a chance meeting on a dusty road, a man's gentle hands braiding a little girl's hair, and the courage to believe that love could heal even the deepest wounds.